Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, this week in Parashat Hukkat, we actually get to read one of the most hotly debated sections of our Torah, vis-a-vis the rabbinic commentaries. We read the story today of Moses striking the rock. We read the story where Moses ultimately is going to be told that he is not going into the land of Israel. And the commentators spend a great amount of time and energy and ink trying to figure out what it was that was Moses' sin. So much so that one of the later commentators, the Shadal, Shmuel David Lutzato, wrote as follows: Moses, our teacher, committed one sin, but the exegetes, the commentators, have loaded upon him 13 sins and more, since each one of them has invented a new sin. In other words, in trying to figure out what Moses' sin was, all of these different commentators said, well, this is what Moses did, and this is what Moses did. And by the end, Moses has done all these sins, where really and truly there was only one sin. So, normally, I read through this section and I say, okay, look, not much has changed over the years, not much, there's nothing new. But I read a chidush this week. I read a new interpretation that I'd never really heard before, and it's from a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shai Held. And he does a couple of things with this section. First of all, he does a little bit of analysis, and he divides the commentators up into three different groups. So he says, first, there are those who argue that Moses' sin is in how he addresses the people, because he starts off by saying, listen, you rebels. There's another group of commentators who says that it's in the question that he asks the people. Shall we get water for you out of this rock? Or maybe it's the we instead of shall God. And different commentators come at it different ways, but it's on that particular question. And the third group are those who insist that the crime was the fact that he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. So those are sort of the three different groups that are there. But as I said, Rabbi Held comes with a completely different outlook on this, and I think it's actually very, very powerful. So let's open up and look to page 884 in the red Eitz Chaim Chumashim. And we see here is the beginning of our story, verse 2. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's congregation into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die there? Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place, a place with no grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is not even water to drink? So that's the setup to all of this. And then Moses and Aaron came away from the tent of the congregation, from the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces. The presence of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, you and your brother Aaron take the rod and assemble the community, and before their very eyes order the rock to yield its water. Thus you shall produce water for them from the rock and provide drink for the congregation and their beasts. So God hears it and says, here's what you got to do. Moses then took the rod, and we know the end of the story. Moses says, listen, you rebels. I'm now at the end of verse 10. Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank. So, what's the chidush here? And what he does is he recognizes a piece of all of this that the commentators miss, and actually, frankly, Moses misses as well in all of this. He talks about the fact that the book of Numbers is an endless litany, he says, of all of these complaints. And he lists them They grumble about being fed, and when they are being fed, that the food is boring, that they didn't measure up to all the delicacies in Egypt. Moses' siblings complain about Moses' elevated status. They grumble in the spies. They grumble in all of these things, and what happens? In each of these cases, the illegitimate complaint on the part of the people elicits frustration on the part of Moses and anger and punishment on the part of God. So, we've got a complaint that creates frustration for Moses and anger and punishment on behalf of God. What's the difference here as we look at this piece? Sir? Good. So difference number one, there's no anger here on the part of God, right? God just basically says, all right, here's what you need to do. And why is there no anger here on the part of God? We see it in verse 2. Verse 2, the narrator, right, the general voice of the Torah comes in and says a fact. The community was without water. That is the fact. So what they're complaining about isn't a made-up thing. It isn't the fact that, we're so sick of all this manna, we want quail, we want other things. They're complaining about a real issue. There's a real issue that is facing the community. They turn to their leader Moses and they say, we have a problem. We have a real issue here. And Moses, who seems to be so primed in this pattern of complaints and punishment, is not actually hearing what it is that his people are saying. He misses that completely. He comes to God and he's expecting God to get angry at them, but when God doesn't, it frustrates Moses even more, because now this pattern is broken. And so Moses, in his frustration, says, well, if God isn't going to react, I better. And Moses reacts as the punisher, or the rebuker in this case, and says, listen, you rebels. And it's interesting that if we look at the commentators, or if we look at the numbers, or at the verses here, where he says, listen, you rebels, in verse 10, later on, the punishment in verse 24, if we look at it, let Aaron be gathered unto his kin, and he is not to enter the land that I have assigned the Israelite people. And because you, and the word here is rebelled. It's the same word. It's the same word that Moses uses to accuse the people, is the word that God is now saying to Moses. Because you rebelled, because you accused the people of rebelling at Meribah, at the waters of rebellion, right? That is why you are not going into the land of Egypt. It's a very interesting chiddush here that I like I said, I just read it this week. He wrote it a while ago, but I just read it this week, and it opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to the fact that we get so blinded by the patterns in our lives that we don't often see when something is different. We miss that. And that is often what gets us into more trouble than not seeing something at all or not doing something at all. It's the fact that we're so in our rut, in our pattern of behavior, that when a change is required, when something is different, we don't see it and we don't react to it. And I think that, we've been talking so much over these last few months, between Corona, between the social issues that are going on in our country, that we come to this 4th of July, we can't afford to say that this 4th of July is like any other 4th of July. We can't afford just to be in our rut and say, all right, I'm going to go, I'm going to have my barbecue, although it's Shabbos today, it's a whole different issue, right? But I'm going to have my barbecue, I'm going to do my thing and pretend like this is like any other year. It's not. We're all sitting here today on Shabbat with our masks on. We're all trying to figure out how to engage with people within our community to celebrate this day. We're all struggling with the issues that we see in our communities. This 4th of July is different. And unless we hear that voice of the narrator to say, hey, this is different, we're not going to pick it up, we're going to keep going, and that's when we get ourselves into trouble. So this 4th of July that we celebrate, really and truly the birth of one of the greatest nations ever, we have to understand that this 4th of July is different, and we as citizens of that greatest nation need to take that into account and need to act accordingly. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.